think it's on. So let me start with a few words of thanks. And I want to begin with colleagues here at NISA, especially the colleagues in our external affairs team who've made this event possible here this afternoon, with people in the room and also lots of people dialing in online. Of course, all my researcher colleagues named on the first slide, who've been working incredibly hard for months, and in fact now a year and a half, to sort of bring all this work together that we're presenting here today, the dashboard in the index, about which we will be saying more presently. And then above all, of course, the Nuffield Foundation. And there are a number of Nuffield colleagues here in the room and online, Mark Franks, Alex Beer, but also colleagues online, as well as Nuffield colleagues like Nicola Webb. So Nuffield Foundation has been absolutely instrumental in this work as a funder, of course, and we're very, very grateful for that generous support, but also as a constant source of advice and guidance. Whether on the advisory board or informally, you know, it's been a huge pleasure working with Nuffield, and we hope that today is an important moment in this project where we can share this publicly and then take this work forward in the coming weeks and months. Now, to the work itself, Rethinking Regional Regeneration. That is how we're calling it. The project itself has a term in it that you might remember, levelling up. That was once a thing. And look, the language has changed clearly with the new government. The focus is much more on local growth, on devolution, on sharing prosperity, you know, around the regions. But we don't think that the substance has changed much at all, in the sense that the case for reducing regional inequalities, for place-based inequalities, that case remains, and in fact, has probably never been more compelling than today. What we're hoping to bring to this very crowded space, where lots of organizations and individuals are doing work, is a new evidence base, and really focusing on the gaps at quite granular levels. Right, so that we can tailor and target policy more effectively than we have done as a country previously. Now, in this work that we've been doing, we've also been helped, and this is my last word of thanks, by the members of the advisory board, some of whom are here. I'm thinking of Lorna Unwin, Bart Van Ark, and others, and also colleagues who have been more recently associated, like Sophia Casanova from the ONS, and many besides. So our thanks to them as well. Let me then start with our presentation. I'll be setting the scene briefly. Then my colleague Elisa will talk about the dashboard. In fact, not just talk about it, she will demonstrate it to you. That will be followed by some of our work on the local and regional regeneration index that Anna will present. And then I will just wrap up at the end with some thoughts about policy. That in turn will be followed by 3 sets of comments. First up, Mark Franks from Nuffield, then Lorna Unwin, University of Manchester, and also a former member of NISA's Council of Trustees. And then last but not least, Stephen Aldridge from the Department of Housing, Communities and Local Government. After which, of course, we'll throw the floor open to your questions, your comments, and of course those online as well. So that is the running order for this afternoon. Now then, I think it'll come as no surprise to anyone here and online that regional regeneration is so vitally important, because the UK has some of the worst regional or place-based inequalities among the 38 OECD countries. That is true for asset and income inequality. It is also true for healthy life expectancy, as we will see. For instance, within Scotland, some of the gaps in terms of healthy life expectancy are up to 23 years, and that's just within one part of the country. Life satisfaction, which is a measure of well-being. And then again, because we're here in Westminster and we do think about institutions and about political governance, we also have one of the most centralized systems of governance in the OECD, but arguably one that isn't very effective at tackling some of those deeply entrenched structural problems. So all of that adds up to a situation that is not good and has not got better in recent years. Of course, there are lots and lots of people and organizations doing work in this space. I will just mention two. One is the 2070 Commission, which was launched in 2020 to think about what is required over 50 years to really tackle some of those structural issues, and has provided some very, very interesting ideas from which we've learned a great deal. And yes, the 2022 Levelling Up White Paper, which, however you want to judge the follow-up, is a very substantive white paper and one that we've engaged with closely. Why? Because like the 2070 Commission, it has provided a detailed diagnosis of the problem and also made a series of policy proposals to try and reduce regional inequality in a more sustained way. So what do we bring to this work more specifically? We've really focused on two key aspects. One is tracking progress or lack of progress on levelling up, both the economic and the social dimensions of it, by building a dashboard and by building a local and regional regeneration index. And it's the dashboard and the index that we're launching here today. We're also evaluating policies and simulating the impact of alternative policy options to try and reduce those place-based inequalities. Now, some of the things we found, I'll be brief before handing over to Elisa, but it is the case that even since 2019, so pre-pandemic until now, or 2022, some things have not got better. In fact, they've got worse, and we need to be very clear as to what that means for policy going forward. One thing that has got worse is living standards. So the way that we explore living standards is by using something called equivalized household disposable income, which is what? Which is household disposable income that takes into account two things. One is household composition, and the other is housing costs. And some measures of living standards do not take that into account, certainly not housing costs, and that's why our findings, we believe, are different and important. So here you can see the percentage deviation from UK average equivalized household disposable income. And perhaps unsurprisingly, in some parts of the country like London and the Southeast, household disposable income living standards are above the UK average. In many other parts, they are, of course, below the average. But that in itself is not surprising. What is surprising is the recent development, which is where the gap between living standards in different parts of the countries has grown. Now, the ambition of the Levelling Up agenda, as expressed in the white paper, was to narrow the gap. Okay? For every of the 12 missions, you can see that reducing the gap was the objective. Okay? The gap between the most prosperous and the poorest parts of the country. But we haven't seen that. On the contrary, the gap has grown. So let me give you one numerical example. In 2019-2020, so the year before the pandemic, the gap between households in London and in the Northeast, on average, was £4,600 in terms of living standards or equivalized household disposable income. By 2023, so 4 years later, that gap had grown to £7,300. Okay? So that's a widening of the gap, not a narrowing. And there are many other examples besides. Then we move on to productivity. Now, this is probably not a chart that is entirely new to you. Now, we know the differences in productivity between London on the one hand and many other parts of the country on the other hand. But again, what's interesting here is not just the level change, it's also where is this going? So our projections at NISA using our models would suggest that after a slowdown in recent years, London productivity is likely to grow again and to grow quite strongly. Of course, we don't know whether that will happen, but that is the current forecast. In other parts of the country, not only are we not seeing a catching up process, a faster productivity try and get closer to London levels, we're in fact seeing a fall. So in the West Midlands, we're projecting a fall in productivity. Again, the gap is widening, not narrowing. And then we turn to health and well-being. And the gap in healthy life expectancy between the most and least deprived areas in Scotland is more than 23 years in 2022-23, up from 20 years in 2019. So again, we're seeing the opposite of what we want to see. We're not seeing a closing of the gap, it's getting bigger. Now, of course, it's the case that we've seen a number of shocks since 2019, most notably COVID. And COVID placed immense strain on already under-resourced healthcare services and therefore contributed to this. But COVID isn't the only explanation, nor is the longer term impact of Brexit or the recent spike in inflation. We're also seeing the wrong sort of policy interventions and not enough political leadership. We'll come to that towards the end. Just to mention, well-being in broader ways in parts of the country, including parts of the southwest, which is not the poorest part of England, we see immense challenges that add up to some decline in well-being, a complex combination of things like low earnings, poor mental health outcomes, issues with teacher recruitment and retention. All of this adds up to less life satisfaction and less well-being. Now, this is really key. It's the interaction of a lot of these things that often ends up to the final outcome. Okay, it's not driven by one thing only. It's not all driven by productivity, but productivity is a big part of this. It's not all driven by wages or growth, but again, it's a big part. We are keen to reflect the importance of social indicators as well, and that goes for health, well-being, and others. Pride in place. Now, at this point, I will just briefly talk about the data and the dashboard before handing over to Elisa. So a couple of things to say. One is the Levelling Up white paper is the basis because we're keen to evaluate how this agenda is going. The language has changed, the substance remains the same. The 12 missions are relevant to any government. And let me just remind everyone in the room what they are. So the first mission is on job and productivity. That includes pay and other indicators of employment. The second is R&D investment. The third is public transportation. The fourth is digital connectivity. The fifth is school education, notably primary school education standards. The sixth is skills. The seventh, health. Eighth is life satisfaction. 9, pride in place. 10, housing. 11, crime, or crime reduction more specifically. Not that anyone wants to see an increase in crime. And 12 is devolution. I promise you I won't ask you at the end of the session whether you remember all 12. But the point is, it's very broad, it's very comprehensive, and perhaps what's going to be happening with the new government, though we're still awaiting a strategy, is a more focused approach, probably picking some of those missions as areas of priority rather than trying to make progress on all 12. But what we've done is we have assembled data and brought it together in a dashboard. And we think that the added value to existing dashboards and existing scorecards is as follows. The first added value is temporal consistency. So all the data that we have compiled, we have cleaned and brought together in this dashboard covers the period 2019 to 2023. And a lot of the time series go back to 1997 or even earlier, so that you can compare things over time. Okay? You can now track things going back 4 years, 10 years, 15, sometimes more than 20 years. And that we think is very, very important for people to get a picture. What's happened in the short term, what's happened in the medium term, or going back further. The second added value is spatial consistency. Okay? We have assembled and compiled and cleaned data for all of the places, the United Kingdom, that is the 3 devolved nations, all the English regions at different levels of granularity. So we've done this so that you can compare, for instance, places either at what's called ITL1, that is International Territorial Level 1, that's the 12 regions, or ITL2, that's 41 regions, or ITL3, that's 182 sub-regions, or local authorities, of which there are about 382 across the United Kingdom, 317 in England, and so on. Again, really important to have the granularity so that you know where the gaps are and how you can begin to address them. And then third, and finally, we think that an added value of our dashboard is that it's user-friendly. This is a public good, right? We're providing this free of any registration or subscription. Why? Because that is both in line with Nuffield philosophy and NISA philosophy, to provide a public good that people can use for their own work, for their own purposes, as a contribution to evidence and to better policy. It's a single hub, so that if you're looking for data, you don't have to look in different places. It's all in one dashboard. Users can explore progress by mission or compare places, and Elisa will demonstrate this presently. And more than that, you can download not just our charts, and hopefully credit us for us, and indeed Nuffield, but you can also download the data and then explore and analyze our data for your own purposes. Okay, that is part of the added value. Now, you've heard more than enough from me, and that is why I shall now give the floor to Lisa to talk us through the dashboard. Thank you very much.
In addition to this first link, there is also a link to understand the definitions of the different geography levels, which map the technical names to the user-friendly names used in the dashboard. For instance, the technical name ITEL 1 refers to the UK's 12 regions, while ITEL 2 refers to 41 sub-regions. Our dashboard has data at both levels and also at the level of the 382 local authorities, as Adrian had mentioned before. On the right-hand side, we can see our regional regeneration index. It shows the overall progress for all the 12 missions from 2019 to 2022 across the developed nations and English regions at sub-regional level, corresponding to ITEL 2 level. We will provide more information on this later. On the left-hand side, below the initial text, you have the choice to start exploring the data either from one of the 12 webinar missions or from a geographic area. We will illustrate what the dashboard offers by looking at mission 1 first. On the left-hand side, you will see a short description of the mission. Mission 1 focuses on jobs, pay, and productivity. On the right-hand side, you will find the regeneration index for mission 1, a sub-regional level corresponding to ITEL 2 level. You will also be able to download the map on the top right. Our index analysis containing the mission's map can be downloaded by clicking on the link below the mission description. We will talk in further detail about the maps shortly. Below the description of the mission, we have a list of indicators, which correspond to the headline and supporting metrics considered in the Leveling Up white paper. We have aimed to collate data on all the headline metrics and as many of the supporting metrics as possible, subject to uniformity of definitions and coverage across all parts of the country. To reiterate, for each metric, we have compiled the publicly available data for as many years and geography levels as available. In the search bar under Choose Place, you can choose to compare up to 4 different geographies at the same level across the UK. For example, Leeds and Bradford, which are 2 distinct local authorities within 8 miles of each other. Around 50 years ago, they were at similar levels of economic and social development. We can use this dashboard to examine the recent divergence between Leeds and Bradford with respect to this mission. You can either search by name of place or by postcode, as I'm doing here. Note that you can adjust the time period by adjusting the start and end dates on the top of the page. Looking at GVA per hour worked, Leeds is significantly more productive than Bradford, though this gap has narrowed over the last few years. We can expand the graph to have a clearer view. Above the chart, we have a table showing the raw data, which you can download here on the top right. You can also download the charts on the bottom left. Meanwhile, other indicators show a more mixed narrative, such as gross domestic household income per capita and proportion of workless households with dependent children, an indicator that reflects child poverty and educational disadvantage. Now let's turn to Mission 4. After COVID, there was substantial investment to extend digital connectivity across the country. We know that large cities have seen significant improvements, but what about smaller, third-tier cities. Let's look at Belfast, the city of Edinburgh, and Swansea. We can see that there are no significant differences between these local authorities in the provision of 4G coverage by at least one operator. All three cities have had more than 99% coverage in the recent years. On the other hand, in the beginning of the period 2020 to 2023, there were significant differences in gigabit availability. For instance, Swansea had just 30% coverage, Belfast had 70%, and Edinburgh just over 80%. In short, the data show evidence of some catch-up and convergence. Knowing that this country has a deep productivity problem, which is also reflected in second-tier cities lagging behind London, let's now go back to Mission 1 and compare Greater Manchester, east and west of inner London. With the exception of workless households with dependent children, all comparable charts show a similar pattern, at least since 2014, where inner London West is the best performing sub-region, while Greater Manchester shows up at the bottom. If we allow the data to start from 1997, we can see an increasing inequality in those charts with available data. We also find that the proportion of workers' households in total households with dependent children has overall decreased for all three sub-regions. As I mentioned in the beginning, you will also be able to start your search from place rather than mission. Once a place is chosen, you will land on this page, which will undergo further development. As we further develop the dashboard, this will contain links to our analysis of places related to the specific choice made by the user. It will also link to our indexes specific to the chosen area, so that the user can clearly see which measures and missions need improvement. From this page, you will also be able to choose a mission, after which you will land on the same page I showed you before. This unique dashboard is publicly available and freely accessible with consistent data stretching back to 1997 and across 382 local authority areas. You can compare places by mission, download the data, and use it for your own purposes. Please remember they will stand ready to help you with analysis and comments or quotes for your pieces. My colleague Arnab will now say a few words about the mission-specific maps and the underlying indices you can see on the dashboard.
Thank you very much, Eliza and Adrian. Before that, am I audible? Yeah, pretty good. Okay. Right. So Adrian has mentioned the 12 leveling up missions, and obviously we all remember all the 12 missions by now. I think the point that Adrian made is that this list is sort of was intended to be quite exhaustive rather than specific. That was its purpose. So in terms of trying to understand regional regeneration through the lens of the missions, what we have tried to do initially is to create mission-specific indices. Why? Because that then helps us focus attention on specific areas where there are larger differences across different parts of the country on a uniform basis, as mentioned, including all parts of Northern Ireland, Wales, and Scotland. And then, therefore, to design policy which is adequate for addressing these deficiencies. That then gives us a platform to try and understand where the biggest differences lie and where the biggest change has happened over the period 2019 to 2022-23. Now, from our analysis, it turns out that the place where, or the area where we have fallen behind the most is in local public transport, particularly local public transport. Now, in each of these 3 or 4 cases that we are going to show, there will be 3 maps. All right, the map on the left plots the situation, the spatial distribution in 2019. Right, the index itself is unit free; it is standardized. Right, so this sort of shows the distribution, positive and negative, with 0 being somewhere in the middle. Okay. Now, related to that position, in the middle one map, we have the position in 2022. That shows us, that tracks progress in across each of the places in what has happened, in this case, with respect to Mission 3 public transport in every place of the country. And we can see immediately that compared to this map here, there's a predominance of reds here. That basically indicates that all places, in fact, all places, all local authorities, well, all ITL 2 regions, 41 ITL 2 regions in the United Kingdom have fallen behind with respect to public transport. Why is that the case? Well, we are hit by the COVID pandemic. A lot of public transport basically went out of use at that point because of lockdowns and so on and so forth. And subsequently, we think that particularly because of stresses on local authorities and local government, financial stresses on local authorities and local governments, they have not come back to an adequate position so far. Also, there is working from home, which might influence some of this. Right. Then the third map, what it shows is the difference between these two. And that is what gives us an idea about where the difference has been largest and where it is the least. And in this particular case, what we find is that in the 3 devolved nations, Wales, Northern Ireland, and Scotland, there's the most red. So that is how we interpret these maps. Well, is this the only place where we have fallen behind? No. There are at least 2 other missions with us in where we have fallen behind across the country. One is primary school education, and the other one is housing. Once again, one can immediately see the connections with the COVID pandemic and the fallout from that. Right. But then, is it all bad news? Well, it is not all bad. In terms of digital connectivity, we have made huge strides. Again, partly as a result of the COVID pandemic, when people had to work from home. So this connectivity and other facilities was a need of the hour, national need, and that was provided to people. So across all parts of the country, there has been an improvement. In some places more than others, but there has been an improvement everywhere. Once again, is it the only place where we see progress, where we see regeneration? No. Well, one of the other areas where we also find regeneration is in reduction of crime. So we are not going to show all the maps to you here, but they are available on the dashboard. You can add together with our analysis there, right? So you can go ahead and have a look at it. Crime is a bit more mixed. So in some inner city areas, particularly urban areas, there has been increase in crime, including some boroughs in London. and some areas, well, Birmingham in particular. But then by and large, over the entire country, there has been reduction in crime. The other place that we would, area or mission that we would like to point out is devolution. Of course, between 2019 and 2022, nothing much has happened. Well, there were new devolution deals which have been written, but disbursements have been relatively minor there. But over the longer period of time, since 2014, we see substantial improvements in devolution. Whether that contributes to means or ends is a different question. Right. So putting these 12 missions together, we find that there are three major directions in which they contribute towards our understanding of regional regeneration. One direction is living standards, broadly defined, pay, productivity, jobs, so on. The second one is health and well-being. And the third one is empowerment and devolution. We put these three together to create our aggregate local and regional regeneration index. Now, largely because of the fact that in terms of living standards, there has been very little progress. And in terms of well-being as well, there has been very little progress across the country. Progress here is really minimal. But once again, the maps give us a clear sense of where are the local, at a local level, the winners and losers. Now, why has that been the case? So we are trying to analyze a little bit of that. And that we are doing here in terms of four maps. On the left-hand side is another representation of the picture about productivity, which Adrian showed earlier. But here now, plotted across parts of the country. See, the larger productivity challenges in the country lie in this belt here at the center. So from the northeast there, Yorkshire and Humberside, East Midlands, West Midlands, Wales, and Northern Ireland. Right? So, in terms of regeneration in public and higher education R&D, do we see a large concentration there in these places? No, we have not seen that. What about leveling of funds? Well, leveling of funds show more of a concentration in the areas that were more needed. But then again, that headline figure somewhat hides the more important fact that leveling of funds are only 3.5% of total infrastructure investments. And infrastructure investments have still concentrated for very good reasons, efficiency and otherwise, in London and the South regions, right? So it is not surprising that we have not seen substantial progress in regional regeneration. Now with that, I hand over to Adrian.
Thank you very much indeed, Elisa and Arnab. Very, very briefly, two more slides before we have comments. And they are really about what does this mean for policy? Well, again, we are only giving a small snapshot of some of what we found, but the two headline arguments are really about public investment. So the first thing to say is that if we are going to be addressing those needs, which are often local or sub-regional or regional, it needs to be targeted, tailored public investment. So that means if you are going to be improving transport, yes, of course, you might want to think about a cross-country line. And we all know the problems of lack of connectivity in terms of transport across the north, especially cross-country. But it's also our bus lines. It's also trying to work out where do you invest in bus lines and related public transport that can help you fill those gaps much more quickly. Right? Because train lines actually take a lot longer to build. Bus lines can be more quickly reinstated or set up in the first place. And then the next gap is housing. So housing is not just about an overall target. And of course, we welcome ambitious house building targets. It's not just saying, oh, let's build 300,000 in a vast region. Where are you going to build them? Where exactly are you going to build them so that it benefits both people who are in need, but also where it fits in with the infrastructure? Do you have all the supporting infrastructure to make that work? Do you have not just water and electricity, naturally, but also things like the schools, the GP surgeries, and other infrastructure that you need to make this a meaningful intervention. So here we're saying that, for instance, in London, where you have jobs and other infrastructure, you lack the affordable housing, right? Or in parts of the Golden Triangle. I mean, anecdotally, in Cambridge, where there's a lot of job growth, you don't always find the housing appropriate for the people that Cambridge is trying to attract. So there are family homes that are being built. But what about, for instance, individual postdoc researchers? They won't be able to afford a family home, yet they still need a place where to live, okay? So it's not just about the number of houses, also the range of housing. And it's, of course, also linked to things like upgrading the existing housing stock, which itself is connected with things like net zero, making houses more energy efficient, better insulated, and so on. So this is about very, very targeted interventions we're talking about. The third area, is skill spending. Without spending more, we think that by devolving skill spendings to lower levels, you might get better value for the money you're spending, because you're involving local authorities or city regions or mayoralties in identifying needs, and then together with others, especially mixed HE/FE colleges, universities where they are, and so on, trying to design and deliver the right sort of programs to redress the skills mismatches that we are seeing across the country. So there are some examples of what targeted, tailored public investment projects could and we think should look like. And then there's a final bigger point, which is just the sheer lack of investment. Anna, final slide, showed that very, very clearly. Every additional investment is, of course, welcome, but we just simply haven't been investing in this country at the right sort of scale. Both public and business investment are lower by historical comparison, so lower than in previous decades, never mind in the post-war era, but also by international comparison. We used to be middle of the OECD. Now we're more towards the bottom of the OECD when it comes to public investment and business investment. We think that to ramp up, to boost public investment, we do need a reform of the fiscal rules. At the moment, they are discouraging public investment. We do need to identify the right projects so that we can make the case for immediate benefits that arise from public investment, but of course also make the point that public investment will help unlock business investment, because without public investment, businesses will not always invest. You need public investment for business to leverage that. It's not just R&D, it's also other things where the private sector can't do it all unless and until the public sector also gets involved. Now, that is complicated, and we do realize that it involves measuring the multiplier effects and the spillover effects, but that's precisely the work that we will do going forward with NISA modeling capability and the dashboard in the index that we now have. So these are just some thoughts on policy, but as I said, we have certainly spoken enough now, and I'd like to invite, in the first instance, Mark Franks to deliver some comments, followed by Lorna Unwin, and then Stephen Aldrich, after which we'll have Q&A. So do please remember your questions. Thank you very much. Mark.
Okay, well, welcome everybody. Thank you for attending this afternoon. Adrian started off with some very kind comments about the Nuffield Foundation, and I'd like to return some of that gratitude to Adrian and indeed Arnab and Elise and the Visa team who have worked on this piece of work, and indeed everybody who's been involved, including through the advisory board and in other ways. Part of that thanks extends to the fact that this is an incredibly ambitious piece of work. My background before working mainly with academic research at the Nuffield Foundation was in government, and in government quite often you had impossible questions to answer, and you had to do the best you could with the data available to answer. In academic research, the emphasis is slightly different. It is on doing the most rigorous research possible and answering questions in the best way possible, using the rigorous data and the rigorous methodologies. And I think what Lisa managed to do here is combine elements of both of that. So I think this question of how you might measure leveling up, or whatever you may now call it in the current incarnation, regional regeneration, is absolutely the question that needs to be answered. But in a sense, it's unanswerable. But what they've done is they've really ambitiously and really carefully thought about the best possible way of doing that. And in doing so, applied some really rigorous academic thinking to it. So I think the ambition and the scale of the rigor is to be applauded, and I think it makes this a unique program of work. Now, I should say a little about us, the Nuffield Foundation, and why we funded this. So we're an independent charitable trust with a mission to advance social well-being, and we fund and support rigorous research and analysis to change people's lives for the better. And we do that through funding a large amount of research, and we also house several in-house research institutes. And we want research we fund both through those institutes and the research done by others to ensure the development of economic and social policy is underpinned by robust evidence. Now, as Adrian set out, by many economic measures, the UK is one of the most geographically unequal countries in the developed world. And so why might this concern the Nuffield Foundation? I mean, first of all, I think there's two reasons. The first I would emphasise is that it's implausible that the level of inequalities that we see across different regions represents the best use of resources or maximise the quality of people's lives. And secondly, it can't be reflective of equal opportunity or high levels of social mobility. And so therefore our desire to use research to change people's lives for the better is inseparable from understanding and addressing the inequalities between different parts of the UK, which is why we're delighted to be able to support the development of the dashboard. And understanding and addressing inequalities between different places has been a central theme in many of our largest and most high-profile projects of the Foundation. So we funded the Economy 2030 review by the Resolution Foundation and LSE, which highlighted the unusually large gap in productivity between London and the UK's other major cities compared to other countries. The IFS Deaton review, supported by us, identified the depth of the UK's inequalities by place, as many others, including Visa, have, and it examined how they intersect with other inequalities in terms of issues such as race, gender, disability, and social background. And the Pissarides review into work and wellbeing, being carried out by the Institute for the Future of Work, Imperial College and Warwick, is exposing big differences in opportunities and capabilities to respond to technological change across different parts of the UK. So this is part of a broader programme of work which I think is shedding real light on exactly what the geographic challenges for the UK are. And what we've seen is that by focusing on different places, we get to understand the specific context around specific places. And we'll be launching a new strategy next year, which will further emphasise our interest in understanding and identifying scope for action at the local level. But before I finish and hand over to other remarks, I'd like to share a few comments or observations from other Nuffield research in this area relating to geographical inequality. So we know that spatial inequalities in many aspects of well-being begin even before birth, and these are reinforced across early childhood through education and into adult life, including through work. And inequalities between places exist on a wide range of dimensions, each with its own unique geographical distribution. And in such a context, neither local level action on its own nor national level action on its own will be sufficient, and both need to happen in a coordinated way, which I think speaks to some of the policy recommendations Adrian set out. There's much evidence pointing towards potential benefits from devolution of powers, and I would include in that fiscal devolution, although you need the capabilities to make that happen. But we actually don't have a great understanding yet of what combinations of powers are effective at the local level and why. So I think that's an area where further research is a priority. And finally, I think the importance of housing and the housing market comes through both in this work, but also it's a recurring theme in the evidence we've assembled. It's a potential driver of early childhood poverty, with all of the effects from that I've spoken of. and it's a determinant of geographical and social mobility, and also other factors that the foundation is interested in, such as teacher supply. So in terms of reacting to this work, I have not much more to say at this stage, except that there are a couple of things that come across to me at a high level. I mean, it's quite stark that in some areas we've seen national decline over the period of study, at least on the measures set out, in a number of areas, including transport, education and housing. But I think it's important that when we look at that picture, we don't ignore the differences between areas that still exist, even on those areas where they've seen the more general decline. It's also interesting that in some areas of the dashboard, there's been much more variable outcomes in relation to such factors, such as life satisfaction and pride in place, slightly less tangible concepts, although this work has done a good job at attempting to measure them and understanding what's driving those changes. I think is a really interesting research question going forward. So just to re-emphasize, I think this is a hugely challenging and hugely ambitious piece of work. And I applaud Lisa for being brave enough to take it on and make such a serious attempt at it. And while I don't think it gives us all of the answers yet, it gives us some hard questions that we need to be asking about why these indicators are showing what they're showing and why those differences exist. And I know that the team are committed to continuing to develop this approach. So I'm sure they'll be open to suggestions as to how it may be made even better or even more rigorous. But I think it's an incredibly valuable attempt to do this in a way that hasn't been done before. And I'm proud that we, the foundation, are associated with it. So on that note, thank you very much. And I look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thank you very much, Mark.
Okay, hello everybody. This, yeah, it's working. Yes, you can hear me. Yeah, thank you. Just in case the University of Manchester gets the jitters, I'm actually from the University College London. But
Sorry, my mistake.
And thank you for inviting me to speak, because this is a very, very important project, as we've already heard. And I think, as it's absolutely clear, it has got the potential to really make a step change in helping local areas improve and thereby improve people's individuals' life chances. What I wanted to just say a few words about, though, was not the actual economics of all of this and a lot of the mechanics of the dashboard, but to really encourage those who are going to use it to get those silos to talk to each other. Because what the dashboard contains is lots and lots of data, but all in different compartments. And someone needs to join up the dots. Because what's been clear from the previous remarks is that we can't make the changes that have been advocated here without actually making change across a number of different areas. So that process needs to be more than, it's going to take more than statistical expertise. It's got to be driven, I would argue, by what I would call a co-construction approach. So by that, I mean, it's got to be driven through a process that brings the analysts together with relevant stakeholders at local level, at national level, at regional level, so that everyone can learn more about each other's problems and frustrations. A lot of the work I've done over the years, lots of research, including some, I have to say, in recent years across Greater Manchester, for example, has shown how difficult it is in this country for stakeholders in different areas of the public realm to understand where each other is coming from and what are the barriers to them changing behaviour. So what we need to do is build the professional expertise to maximise the dashboard's potential. And that's going to take some work, I think, at all three levels: local, regional and national. Have we actually got the expertise in place? What professional development is needed to have more of a partnership approach, which is something that the UK's policy making and governance, the centralised nature of that, I think has worked against in probably for a long time, but certainly in recent years. So the production of data, for example, in areas that I work in to do with skills and education, show that there are persistent and ongoing skill shortages and gaps. Often, though, that data isn't aligned with local data, for example, on apprenticeship provision, with data on access to vocational training. It tends to be aligned just with qualification attainment data. But what I hope is that this dashboard will make people look behind that data and ask some harder questions. Transport I mentioned earlier, and that's absolutely critical. How easy is it for somebody locally to get to a local college? Are the colleges open in the evening? Are they open at weekends? How easy is it for an adult, for example, to do a course? How easy is it for an employer to get business support? Where do they go? Who do they talk to? So I think the dashboard needs to be seen as a living tool, not just to generate data that answers specific questions, but to be used as a means to generate new questions. What does the data not tell us? Which parts of the data don't fit what we see on the ground when we do qualitative work in local areas? A particular bugbear of mine is the whole low skills, the use of that language, underachievement, and so on. Largely based on qualification attainment. How many people in this country, skilled people, go under the radar in such a system? In the UK's highly unregulated labour market, do we really know enough about the types and levels of expertise being both demanded and deployed by employers, given the diversity of workplaces? So my final point, this might seem fanciful, but I was tidying up some of my grandchildren's toys the other day, so they stayed over the holidays. And there are two Russian dolls that always I end up having to find the bits of under beds and so on, just to get taken apart and not put back together. And I thought, well, the dashboard is a bit like a Russian doll. So it's a series of smaller and smaller dolls which connect together to make a whole. Learning how those pieces interconnect, I think, is the big challenge. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Please, Stephen. Yeah, thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much. And it's great to have been invited to speak here today. On to follow, we've had two excellent sets of comments already, so I hope I can add a bit of value to what we've already heard. In my view, the National Institute's local and regional regeneration dashboard and index are invaluable, and they're a really timely contribution to the understanding of the debate about national and subnational economic and social performance. In preparing for these remarks, I had calls to look up on the Institute's website its mission. Perhaps the buzzword of our time. It says there that the mission of the Institute is to carry out research into the economic and social forces that affect people's lives, to improve the understanding of those forces and the ways in which policy can bring about change. And it seems to me that what we've heard today is entirely in accordance with that mission put in place for the Institute over 85 years ago. So it's great to see. As we've heard, the dashboard and index mobilised data of it's more than 100 economic and social variables at national and subnational level. And brilliantly, they're standardised so that robust comparisons can be made across time and space. And that's immensely valuable to policymakers and practitioners alike. So I would say the work is a first-rate case study in the effective use of data, and no less importantly, in how to draw out clear and accessible insights on delivering those data. So the charts and maps we've been shown during this session are really quite fantastic. And that ability to explain it clearly is perhaps something too often overlooked these days. Everyone loves data and data dashboards, but we mustn't forget we need the right data, and we need to be able to draw insight from it. And I think that's a contribution made by this work. The end result of the Institute's work is a product that's both useful to policymakers, as I say, indeed anyone interested in economic and social policy. And there's a tool here that analysts and data specialists in government fields can learn from. Good data and its analysis matters for many reasons. They can improve people's lives. Comments we've heard here about some of the disparities where improvements need to be made, illustrate that powerfully. They can help us better understand problems and to take better decisions about how to address them. We saw that in Adrian's comments and where policy might need to change and adapt. And they can help us monitor and evaluate what difference our actions are making. And in the case of public policy, whether the measures we're taking are effective and value for money. I guess there's some important issues in some of the data and relationships we've heard about today. What is causing what, and whether some of these things would have happened regardless of what government had done. But nonetheless, we can't make better use of existing public resources if we don't know what is happening and why. As Adrian said, the Institute's dashboard and index are structured around the build on the 12 levelling up missions in the 2022 levelling up white paper. The new government uses, of course, the language of local growth and its own 5 missions of economic growth, clean energy, improving the NHS, creating safer streets, and improving opportunity for all of that which we'll hear a great deal more. So I think the important thing is that the metrics that underlie the 12 levelling up missions are fundamentally focused on the country's underlying economic and social problems, which the present government's 5 missions are also seeking to address. The new government may have different values and priorities or seek to respond in different ways, but the underlying economic and social problems that it faces, I think, are still much the same. So the Institute's dashboard index are no less relevant and powerful, particularly when the metrics that are underlying the 12 missions are brought together. So I like the grouping around equal opportunity in public services, community empowerment, and productivity and living standards. Of course, the Institute's not alone in this space. The Office for National Statistics, my own department, and many others have, of course, contributed to and continue to contribute to the development of new data tools and their analysis. But there's ample scope for competition and the innovation and creativity of the bridge. And the truth of that is clear in the great work that National Institutes have presented this afternoon. There's some areas where I might do things differently, and we might get into some of these in the discussion. So, for example, I wondered about whether housing might fit more appropriately under the productivity and living standards heading rather than community empowerment. To debate that. I might question whether devolution is a means rather than an end. I think someone else mentioned that. Does it not feel a bit oddly? Isn't devolution the means to the other thing? So why is it included here? Or I might argue that the diffusion and adoption of innovation are rather more important than R&D spending, especially if reducing some of those local and regional disparities we've heard about. But these are all sort of perhaps points of a more second order nature. There's always scope for refinement, and none of it distracts from the power and usefulness of the tools and insights that we've already been presented with. I think the data and insight that the dashboard and index bring together and highlight will much help us to improve and sharpen the focus of economic policy. So again, Adrian and the team's presentations highlighted a number of areas where we might want to think further. I'm a bit of a hobby horse about the importance of bus services. I was glad to see that highlighted, but I know others love trains. I think it will help us to perhaps drive more public service innovation and reform. I think that's really important. And perhaps above all, what's here will help us improve policy and decision making with consequential benefits for policy effectiveness and value for money, which is certainly something our new Chancellor is much concerned with, and very important in these fiscally constrained times. So I greatly commend the Institute's work to everyone here and beyond, and look forward to working with the Institute further on in the future. Well done.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much to Mark, to Lorna from UCL, and to Stephen for their very generous remarks. Now we want to throw it open to the audience here and online. So let's collect some questions and indeed comments. You know, this is very much a conversation we want to have with you here and online. Really, really keen to hear your thoughts, including suggestions as to how we could or should do things, where we can do better, or indeed some of those questions that you think we need to raise before we can begin to answer them. This is very much work in progress. I know that's a cliche in the academic and research community, but some cliches happen to be true. This is one such moment when work in progress seems very apposite. So let's have some questions or comments. Up, gentleman on the left as well. So take those two first, and then we'll also alternate with questions from our online audience. But
sure. Yes. Well, first of all, congratulations that, you know, having been on the advisory board for this, to have seen the projects come to completion, and it's been great to be part of the journey. I agree with the commentators. It's really important work, and it's very important that we move this forward. And my question really to the team is, how are we going to move this forward? Instead of updating, I really want to come back to the point. How do we engage with the stakeholders here? At the Productivity Institute, we care really about how do we bring these kind of good information to the stakeholders, in this case probably local authorities and combined authorities, to actually use them in terms of making their plans and so on and so forth. So just having it out there is great, but the next question is, how do we bring it to them, and how do we show them how we can make it useful? So I was wondering if there are any thoughts around that, because I think that will really bring it to life, which I think we're all looking forward to. But again, congratulations. I'm really happy to see it at this point. Thanks.
Thank you. My name's Ian Gordon. I'm a grumpy old economic geographer and civil servant. So I remember coming here 59 years ago talking to David Worthing when Brown was about to launch his study on the framework of regional economics. I can't find a copy of the library.
And that is because the copy is in my office. So I apologize.
I looked last week and I couldn't quickly see it.
Yeah.
But I think there's several points there. I mean, one is that this is not a new problem. It's a problem, it's not ancient. It's a problem which is about 123 years old. So 1921 is the point of, yes, 1921 is the point of which there's a turnaround in the relationship between North and South, and there's a cumulative issues of uneven growth between those two things, which go back that far. 60 years ago, when I was in DEA, 59 years ago, when I was in DEA, when we were working on these sorts of issues, they have a similar kind of character to it. So they're not things which are suddenly going to go away. They're things which have suddenly evolved. We're talking about, in relation to education and so on, we're talking about the cumulative effects of, I don't know how many generations, of selectivity in education, class differentiation between places and so on. And it's regeneration is an improvement as a way of talking about this as compared with leveling up, but in the suggested processes that you call the complex processes. But I'm frankly disappointed in the lack of interest in process behind the dashboard. I mean, the dashboard just seems to be producing numbers and trying to read some story off the map. And what a very complicated things behind it, which thousands of people have actually done a lot of work on in the last 50 years or so in trying to understand this. And I think it ought to be brought to bear, because what the other actors, which I also agree is very important to bring other stakeholders on board and get beyond simply a public sector or private sector approach to it. What they need is an understanding and shared understandings, debate about how we understand these complex and cumulative processes, not simply a confrontation with data. So I'm unhappy about that. And the other thing I'm unhappy about as a geographer is the lack of any sense of space. The idea that you have data for some arbitrarily defined hierarchy of areas, bureaucratically defined hierarchy of areas, which you can then look at on a map and make sense of, doesn't itself make sense, because these areas interact with each other. Things spill over from one to another. The functional economic region around here is something which in some senses stretches from Lincolnshire to Devon in Brecon in Wales, in terms of the repercussions across housing markets. And when you're talking about affordability of housing, it's not something to do with what's available inside London or inside chunks of London, really at all. It's to do with constraints on the supply of housing, which have been operating in recent decades over much of that region, and the repercussions of those. And labour markets stretch across very large areas. So I think it's, in a way, it's a step backwards to present people with a set of maps and say, right, let's try and make sense of the differences in those. Just as I think also it's a step backwards not to look at longer time spans and see how far, if you look at the history of past fluctuations, you see continuity and discontinuity and so on. So I'm sorry to be a grumpy old man like this, but they have their functions.
Well, thank you both for these, excellent comments and questions. I will, I think, turn, if I may, to Anna for the question about both process and geography. But I'll say a few things as well. I mean, first of all, on Bart's question, thank you, Bart, both for the question and for all your advice and guidance on the advisory board. Absolutely, part of the project, which will run for another just under 2 years, is precisely to to engage with the various stakeholders. I mean, we already have very good relations with colleagues at the Greater London Authority, Greater Manchester Combined Authority, but we also have some specific projects, part of the grant, that we're going to be taking forward, having now built the dashboard and the index, and that would be much more specific area analysis. So whether it's, for instance, Leeds and Bradford, which was mentioned, or some of the coastal areas, like, for instance, Grimsby or Southend or Blackpool, or indeed some of the second or third tier cities, we have some specific things that we'll be doing, and we'll be talking to local authorities and indeed other stakeholders in the area, whether it's business, whether it's mixed HEFE colleges, whether it's trade unions or universities. So there's a number of things that we're going to be doing in the second half of the project that speaks to exactly that. And this also relates to some of what Lorna said. We are going to be trying to collect however much qualitative evidence we can to build that into this. Right? This is not just about numbers. This is not just about statistics. We believe at the National Institute, like others do, that it's a combination of qualitative and quantitative evidence combined with narrative. You have to bring this to life. This isn't just, trying to interpret a set of data, but narrative without numbers also doesn't work, because it quickly can become too subjective, too anecdotal, lacking in objectivity. And so it's really the balance of evidence, and it's the balance of narrative and number that we're hoping to achieve. But absolutely, the engagement with stakeholders, very close to the ground, is vital. And of course, that also includes people in central government. We believe in the idea and indeed the reality of good government. We want to see good government. And so if we can bring some evidence and some policy ideas to that discussion, that's what we want. Now, of course, ultimately, it's up to policy and decision makers as to whether they're going to take that up. But we will certainly be engaging at the central level as well. And we've already had some, for us, incredibly helpful conversations with Stephen and his team and some other government departments to try and take this forward. Now, on the two really excellent points made by you, and far from being an old grumpy man, I think it's wisdom that we've just heard, and an encouragement for us to take this forward. So on process, absolutely, we're in no way suggesting that the dashboard and the index are the end of the work. They are, in some ways, like we've heard from Stephen in a different context, they're means to another end, which is to think about why something has happened, why it's happened, how we got there, what we can do about it. So they're absolutely not the end point of this work at all. And we have got plans, both as part of the project and beyond, to do much more specific work on, for instance, spillovers. I mean, I mentioned it very, very briefly in one of the slides. Can we begin to measure and to be clearer about spillovers, right? Because there's a lot of debate in economic geography, which you know infinitely more about than I do in terms of agglomeration, right? But of course, one of the questions that arise with agglomeration is that, fine, agglomeration is real. There are some clear effects. We see this with big cities. But for instance, what isn't so clear is whether big cities have all sorts of positive spillover effects on adjacent areas, never mind areas further afield, right? And of course, but then it's also about measuring those to see where there are positive spillover effects, where there are negative ones, and how we then change cities as well, because cities are not going to, get us out of the productivity problem we're in, or the problem to do with living standards or other facts. And we know, of course, that within cities, there's also enormous disparities, and it's not just the case of London, though it is certainly the case of London, that the aggregate picture in London clearly hides, right, conceals from view all sorts of major disparities. So we are going to be interested in process. We are going to look at spillover effects and other things. And the point about functional areas versus, real, as it were, sort of economic and social activities is absolutely taken. We do not in any way pretend that the functional administrative areas are the best reflection of economic and social life, not at all. But given that data is collected in this way, and given that we think data plays a key role in getting an evidence base that can inform policy, we had no choice but to go with functional areas in the first instance. But absolutely, this is not, yeah. No, sure. What I mean is, the administrative borders that we have and the data that is collected according to those administrative categories. But absolutely, we are not treating this as the end point. We know that whether it's, time travel to work or other, ways of thinking about it, of course, we need to really look at the connections between the different areas. And I agree also over larger geographies than just local authorities or time travel to work. So all of that work, we're certainly keen to do. We will need some help, and hope we can draw on your wisdom again in the future. But let me turn to Arnav for some more thoughts on this.
Well, thank you, Ms. You covered many of the bases. I think one of the starting comments that you made, Adrian, really hits the nail on the head, which is that this is really 1 year into a 3-year project. And our objective, so the 1 year has slipped into 1.5 years because of the data challenges. But our first objective was to get the data into place on an uniform basis across the whole of the country in ways that we do not only focus on certain parts of the country, but as much emphasis as we place on the boroughs in London, we also place on the outlying places, regions in Northern Ireland or in the Highlands of Scotland, right? And that itself was our central first objective, to put it all into place. Once we do that, on the basis of this, 2 or 3 things are going to happen, and that is what we have planned. But again, so this is all up to discussion and particularly guidance from our advisory board as well. One is, as Adrian said, we are going to go out to different parts of the country to talk to stakeholders, to try and see how we can take the work forward. Secondly, at the back end of this is something that in our discussions with, I should have said that it is not only 2 years on this project, but there's ongoing work with the Department of Housing, Communities and Local Government. There's ongoing work with Greater London Authority, with Greater Manchester Metropolitan Authority, with Treasury and ONS, of course. So all of these are put together. So this is a big program of work. We are starting really a pretty big program of work, and we are at the beginning of it. But this was the first major step that we really wanted to take before we can move forward onto the other domains. So with respect to spatial work, so of course, sense of space is extremely, extremely important, and that is what we're going to do. Now, given the way that data are collected administratively in the country, it was our decision, and we may revise that, we may refine that later on, that we go down, the place that we can go down to reasonably, within a reasonable period of time, would be the local authority level. That is the lowest level at which we can consistently collect data across the whole and compile data across the whole of the country. Once again, not privileging one place or another, consistently over the entire country, and consistently as far as possible moving backwards. So what we are going to do in terms of creating functional areas is, our current thinking is that we are going to aggregate from that level upwards. We are not at this moment planning to drill down even further. That is, I don't think that's potentially very valuable, but that is a step too far for us. So at least that is what we want to put in place. With respect to timescale, yes, we are collecting the data. Why have we taken 2019-20 as a starting point? Well, for 2 major reasons. One is that it is sort of a starting point. Well, of course, regional disparities, as you rightly said, have commenced at least since the 1920s. However, both the UK's 2070 Commission and the Levelling Up White Paper loosely take the period, pre-pandemic period, as a base. So that is where we are currently considering as a base to try and measure progress moving forward. Of course, in individual cases, we are moving further behind depending on the data available and depending on the context. For example, we talked about progress since 2014 with respect to devolution. So we are doing that. But loosely speaking, at the moment, our central starting point is the pre-pandemic times, right? So the second area where we are also going to take huge steps, and again, this is up to discussion, is that missions are in one place, thinking of the missions loosely speaking as the ends. We are going to tie the missions up with the 6 capitals framework to try and find out which capitals you need to enhance, where, by how much, how do you cost it, so that you can bring about uplift in specific missions and places. So that is how we are thinking, but this is obviously subject to discussion.
Thank you. Okay, another round of questions or comments. Yes, gentleman at the back.
Hello, I've got a question about perhaps conclusions of the data. Are there things that regional or larger local authorities can learn from smaller local authorities, or vice versa, in terms of reducing inequalities?
Okay, thank you. Very good question. Another question or comments before we address that? Not for the moment. Okay. Well, so I suppose there's two thoughts. I mean, one is, you know, the question of scale is of course, thank you. The question of scale, of course, is important here. Not everything that might work at a lower, smaller, you know, level can be transposed. But I think some of the lessons, certainly, that we have come across in the work would suggest that, you know, a more relational approach, you know, can help. By which I mean, you know, an approach that tries to bring the different, you know, different users of public service, for example, or the different stakeholders together, so that, you know, it isn't something that the local authority does to the rest, but it works with the stakeholders to create something. It's along the lines of what Lorna called co-creation. You know, that a more relational, a more mutual approach to public service provision can also then create greater trust, greater cooperation, so that, you know, there is that sense that people are working towards a shared endeavor, rather than one set of people or organizations doing something to someone else who is essentially just a passive recipient. Right? And this is true, for instance, for adult social care, right? Where there are a lot of examples where if you have a more mutual, sometimes even a members-based approach, you know, you can try and overcome some of the barriers in terms of lack of trust and you know, and so on. So I think there are those examples, but the scale question still remains. You know, what works in a small town is not going to be, you know, transposed to London or Manchester easily. But given that all places also are local, you know, depending on the level within London or Manchester you're talking about, then perhaps, you know, you can adopt and adapt certain things. But it would certainly be around scale. But I think the more relational, reciprocal approach is something that has worked. You know, there are examples around the country, like, you know, Preston Council and others, where this has been trialed quite successfully. So that would be, I think, one example. Yes, please, Jeanette, and then the gentleman over there.
You know, if the Labour Party are going to continue with the bidding for devolution money?
Okay, excellent question. And then the gentleman behind Bart.
Hi, to introduce myself, David Adler, editor at American Affairs. It's a related question, which is great research. Is there a legislative strategy related to this research tacked onto it so that policymakers pay attention formally rather than just hoping they do?
Yes. Okay. So on the first question about the bidding process for what used to be called levelling up funds, I don't know, because I don't think we've had any announcement yet. I think we're still waiting to hear, you know, about how some of this work on local growth will be operationalized, and then what the funding situation is. We know from our work and of course the work of Stephen's department that of the 10 billion originally earmarked for levelling up, 3 billion were committed and about 1.3 billion were actually spent. Now, it does take time to allocate funds, and it does take time for funds to be spent. You know, having around about 10% spend of the 10 billion, of course, meant that any progress in that period was always going to be rather smaller, okay? But whether the new government will take this funding model forward, both the amounts of money already pledged and the process, I don't think we know as yet, because I haven't seen any announcements as to what they have in mind. What we do know is that there's an attempt to make growth the overriding objective, that is the central of the 5 missions. And absolutely, you know, we are now dealing with a focus on 5 missions, which to some considerable extent, as Stephen has said, overlap with the 12 missions. But there are some, you know, nuances as well when it comes to energy, for example. But it's really the attempt to not only make aggregate growth the priority and the overarching sort of purpose of economic reform, but also to tie that to local and presumably regional growth plans. Right? I mean, we know that the previous government, I think, even asked for growth and productivity plans. That was, I think, one of the announcements made by the former Secretary of State, Michael Gove. it will be interesting to see how the Council of Nations and Regions and other things will then try and connect these different strategies on growth. The national strategy, regional, local ones, and then what funds and what resources will be committed. But I don't think we've had any announcements. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Stephen, but I think we're still.
Clearly, we've got the budget on the 30th of March, which will set out the outcome of the first round of spending. Then we've got the further announcement in the spring of next year. In terms of competitive bidding, I think it's fair to say that likely we will see some rationalisation of funding for animals. There's a commitment to further devolution of the devolution bill. That might be the answer to the legislative questions. So I suspect we will see rather less competitive bidding, but you're right. The spending review will be the place where that starts.
So on the legislative question, I mean, very briefly, we are not in any way proposing to draft anything because that is not our role, of course. We are keen, though, to do two things. One is to comment when there are opportunities. I mean, the budget is one such opportunity, and NISA always does a response to the budget or to a spring statement, regardless of who's in power. Of course, we are totally independent, non-partisan, and work with government, but also with any shadow team that is interested in our work. But we also keep on making representations on questions like public investment through various channels, whether it's together with our friends and colleagues at the Productivity Institute or other organizations in that space, or in our quarterly, UK Economic Outlook, which has a chapter on the aggregate macroeconomy, but also has now for 4 years had a chapter on households and regions, which is very closely related to this work. And in our interactions with policymakers, we do keep on emphasizing, for instance, the need to find ways of increasing public investment. I mean, in aggregate terms, we think that public investment of 2 or 2.5%, which is roughly where the different parties were proposing, public investment to be after the election, we think that's insufficient to fill some of those gaps. From an aggregate point of view, our view here at the National Institute is that we need between 4 and 5%. That is an extra 40 to 50 billion of public investment per year. Now, how you get there and how you then use those resources, of course, these are two crucially important questions. Again, as I said in the presentation, we don't think that the current fiscal framework is the only way to have stable public finances. Stable public finances are a vital and necessary condition for growth and for investment, but they're not a sufficient condition. And we think that fiscal frameworks can be reformed, right, to reflect the need for greater public investment, and that a credible program of investment would command not just the support, we think, of Parliament and of voters, but also of the markets. Because we also saw in the run-up to the election, a lot of market actors saying that they're very keen to invest in Britain, provided there is stability and a credible program. And so in that sense, this isn't just about, will the markets react, in a negative way when government increases public investment? That is not a certainty at all. I think much depends on what this money is used for. Hence, our point about targeted, tailored investment. You can't just spend money. I mean, HS2 is a very good example of how to spend a lot of money and perhaps not get the results that in some sense were not even planned. But it turns out that it would have been incredibly costly with probably not quite the benefit. And I'm putting it diplomatically. But to say that just because HS2 didn't work out, we can't be doing ambitious, large-scale infrastructure project also doesn't follow. I mean, I can mention another example also related to high-speed rail. HS1 was under budget, delivered in time, and works very well. So there are examples of ambitious, infrastructure projects that have worked. Crossrail or the Elizabeth line, more specifically, is another example. Yes, it was more costly, but the benefits, I think, over time are also very tangible. So, let's not be too as we're despondent after something like HS2. Now, I think we have a question online.
Well, we have a couple, and maybe we can spend a couple of minutes each.
Sure.
One is comes from Natalie, and it asks, whether we are aware of inequalities within regions that can also impact on differences in leveling up between regions. For example, inequalities around race, gender, disability, etc.
Mhm.
And the second one is, it comes in two parts. One is whether we are aware or aligned with the letter to the FT by Professor Mazzucato, and I think Professor Mascatelli as well was one of the signatories, which is on in the context of high levels of debt to GDP ratio, and whether we adjust household composition. So, of course, we adjust for household composition when we talk about living standards, but whether we are also trying to adjust for all cost levels and view regional monetary things on a PPP basis.
Okay. Do you want to take one or both?
Okay, so yes, we are of course aware of differences, intersectionality of differences across regions, as well as different kinds of households and the circumstances and their, the endowments and, where they come from. The objective of this particular project, at least in starting to work with it, was clearly the regions, because that is the objective in the leveling up white paper. That does not take away the fact that we are enormously interested in different kinds of disadvantages across different segments of the population, British population at large. And in particular, our work is closely aligned with a lot of the corpus of work across the National Institute working in these areas, and not least, our chapter 2 of the UK Economic Outlook actually focuses on households as much as it focuses on the region. So we are aware of this. We are going to build in those connections, but this is kind of the first step of that process. Secondly, debt to GDP, I think you are better placed to address.
Well, so I suppose, what I would want to say in response is that, of course, we cannot, ignore the fact that, some 10, 15 years ago, the debt to GDP ratio was around 65%, and now it's 100%, right? And that is an absolutely significant difference, and sustainability of debt is clearly going to be a priority, again, for all the right reasons in terms of market confidence and general investor confidence in the United Kingdom. And yet, the question cannot possibly be, well, just because it's 100%, we now need to worry about, what are essentially arbitrary fiscal targets, because a 5-year falling debt target is arbitrary. Why 5 years? Why not 3 years? Why not 8 or 10 years? There is no economic law that says that debt has to fall over 5 years. Right? So it may be politically expedient to have something like this, but is it economically and socially the best possible fiscal framework is, I think, a question we would always want to ask. And then there's the other assumption that many make, which is that, well, public investment projects either are just wasteful and we should never do them. That's quite an extreme view, but it does still exist. Or, yes, public investment may well be, useful, but it will have a return over, 10, 15, 20 years. And hence, we can't really sort of put our emphasis on that, and we should be doing whatever we can to encourage the private sector. We absolutely believe that the private sector has a vital role to play, including on leveling up, including on regeneration, because without more business investment across the country, especially in the regions lagging behind, of course, we're not going to see significant improvements over time. But the idea of public investment crowding out private investment is simply not so straightforward. Some crowding out is no doubt possible and real, but there's lots of examples of crowding in. We mentioned R&D already, and I agree with Stephen entirely. It's not just about the spend, it's about diffusion and adoption. So we need to think a lot more about how we can use the fruits of research and innovation and how they can then be shared amongst firms and others, so that we have a much better benefit from R&D, which in this country is still very strong and is a national asset also distributed around the country. It's not just happening in one place. And that is an important thing. But it is also about complementarity. Again, transport, housing, other areas show that it can't all be done by the state, but it also can't all be done by the market. And so it's about the complementarity, of course. So 100% of debt is materially different from 65% ratio, but it shouldn't stop public investment, because the only way to get out of higher debt and low growth and low productivity is precisely to boost growth. Growth will be the best way of dealing with debt, so that at some point you can begin to reduce that. But the 5-year target to us seems arbitrary, and if it does discourage public investment, then it's counterproductive. It'll leave us worse off. We'll have a bigger debt problem if we stick to rules arbitrarily and rigidly. Fiscal rules are necessary, but they're not sufficient, as I've said. They are necessary because they are a signal about stable public finances. They're insufficient if it simply means that the position will deteriorate over time. And if you look at the latest OBR fiscal risk report, right? Given the bigger trends of demography, climate change, and so on, unless we invest, unless we grow, unless we become a lot more productive, we'll have a much, much higher debt to GDP ratio. So the status quo is not going to be the answer to the current problems, or indeed the problems further down the line. So we do need urgent fiscal framework reform. And surely the choice can't be between a list-style trust experiment on the one hand, with all the consequences that we saw, and the status quo on the other hand. That is a false choice. Right? That is simply to say there's no alternative to the status quo. We never believe there's no alternative. There are good alternatives and bad ones. Well, let's explore the good ones before we give up on any kind of meaningful reform. So the 100% is not the key question.
Let me just add a single line on the regional monetary policy question. So we have kindly been provided a little bit of resources by the Productivity Institute to work on regional monetary policy. And the leader of that project is seated behind. And so watch this space, there's more coming there.
Absolutely. Okay, are there any other questions? Otherwise, I propose we wrap up and we offer you some much-deserved refreshments in our crafts room, named after Nick Kraft, our former chair of council. I can't see any. Oh, Sophia, please.
Yeah, just a very quick comment from an Office for National Statistics perspective. So I think congratulations on the dashboard, because really bringing together so many data sources and working with geographies is quite challenging. So I saw your point earlier, but there's a lot of work that goes behind creating infrastructure like this. So obviously now we need to move towards gaining insights, but also does not understate the amount of work that goes in there. I think my only comment would be thinking about future developments. Obviously, the moment where we want to use this dashboard also to compare across smaller geographies, we need to take into account uncertainty and how we use communicate uncertainty to our stakeholders. So I know that we discussed this in the past in our advisory committee, but something obviously we can work together in the future, because working at a lower level of geographies increases the uncertainty of statistics, and so obviously we need to make sure that our stakeholders are aware of this, and it's one of our responsibilities when creating a dissemination product. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sophia. And maybe just a final word for me to say that the dashboard, which if you noticed, very closely, we didn't demonstrate live because there could always be a technical glitch, and then you will be stuck unnecessarily. That dashboard will go live tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. But of course, because you've all been here and we will write to you, we will send you that link again just to be certain that you've got it. But it goes live tomorrow morning at 9. And of course, if you have any further thoughts or comments on the work, don't hesitate. You know where to find us. We'd be delighted to have a chat here or elsewhere. And yes, it really is the first step. And today has really helped us be even clearer about what we need to do going forward. So thank you all very much indeed. And please join us for some refreshments next door.